The tension in the Democratic Strategy Summit was already suffocating, but no one could have predicted the eruption that followed Stacey Abrams, the former Georgia gubernatorial candidate and voting rights activist, rose from her seat at the panel table with fire in her eyes, facing across from her Jasmine Crockett, the rising congresswoman from Texas, who had just challenged the very foundation of Abrams' vision for the future of the Democratic Party. Abrams' voice rang through the conference room, filled with donors, activists, and members of the press telling Crockett to get out right now, and the room went still as phones came up to record what would soon ignite political firestorms far beyond those walls. Crockett's next words would not only shake the people present, but send ripples across the entire nation, threatening to reshape the identity of the Democratic Party itself. This was no mere disagreement between two prominent black women in politics. It was a generational battle that exposed deep fractures in the party, with Crockett poised to become either a hero or a pariah, depending on where the listeners' loyalties lay. Abrams entered the summit as nothing less than Democratic royalty, a 50-year-old former Georgia House Minority Leader whose legacy was cemented after a narrow loss in the 2018 governor's race. She became a national figure, founding Fair Fight Action, helping turn Georgia blue, writing best-selling books, appearing on magazine covers, and even being floated for the Supreme Court. In Democratic circles, questioning Abrams on voting rights was akin to heresy. Crockett, however, represented the uninvited future. At just 43, the former Dallas civil rights attorney had only been in Congress since 2023, but was already rattling the establishment. Unlike Abrams, whose career had been built on careful coalition building, Crockett came armed with bluntness, fearlessness, and a refusal to bow to party hierarchy. Abrams preached patience and messaged discipline. Crockett demanded bold action and risk. Taking the summit was meant to be a unity showcase to prepare for the coming election, but what began as a polite panel discussion about reaching young voters spiraled into a dangerous confrontation over whether the party should cling to its traditional voting rights focus or pivot toward economic populism. Abrams delivered a polished speech about protecting democracy through voting access. Her signature caused one that reliably drew applause and donations, but when Crockett took the microphone, she dismantled not Republicans, but the Democratic playbook itself, accusing the party of speaking as if it were still 1965, while younger generations faced unaffordable housing, crushing student debt, and a belief that voting changed nothing in their daily lives. She warned that some celebrated leaders seemed more interested in defending their brand as democracy's saviors and delivering economic change. Everyone knew she was pointing directly at Abrams, whose face hardened as the attack unfolded. The donors who had given her six-figure checks looked stunned. The media scribbled furiously, and the air itself seemed to freeze. Abrams finally stood her chair, scraping the floor, her hands trembling not with fear, but fury. Years of being the unshakable voice of resistance collapsed into a sharp, cutting tone as she addressed Crockett, telling her she misunderstood the summit and the very heart of the Democratic Party. The silence that followed was the kind that breaks before a storm, and every phone in the room was already lit, ready to capture the explosion that was about to make history. The front row looked like it was watching a car crash in slow motion as several prominent donors shifted uncomfortably in their seats. But Crockett did not back down. If anything, she leaned forward, her voice rising slightly as she told Abrams that she understood perfectly what the party stood for, but questioned whether what it stood for was actually working for the people it claimed to represent. Abrams fired back, pointing out that Crockett had been in Congress for barely 2 years, while she had been fighting for voting rights long before Crockett had even considered running for office, listing her record of flipping states, winning elections, and building coalitions. Crockett responded sharply that despite those accomplishments, they were losing young voters to apathy because the party kept framing their biggest problem as voter suppression instead of economic suppression. That remark hit hard, and several younger staffers nodded in quiet agreement, while older Democrats looked horrified. Abrams' tone became sharper, accusing Crockett of wanting to abandon the fight for democracy because it was not trendy enough for social media. Crockett stood up to meet her energy, insisting that democracy was not just the right to vote, but the ability for that vote to improve people's material lives, which for too many Americans was not happening. The moderator tried to step in, but Abrams cut him off, raising her voice and saying that Crockett's argument dismissed the work she had done that she claimed had saved democracy in 2020. Crockett denied dismissing Abrams' contributions, but argued the messaging strategy was failing to connect with the voters they needed. Abrams shot back, crediting that strategy for winning Georgia, securing Democratic senators, and putting Joe Biden in the White House, but adding that apparently it was not good enough for Crockett. The room grew heavier with Tension as Major Donor Reed Hoffman looked ready to vanish, and MSNBC correspondent Joy Reid had her phone out, clearly preparing to report live. Crockett took a breath and made her choice, calling Abrams by her first name and agreeing that she had helped win Georgia, but adding that young voters did not turn out because of voting rights message, rather because Donald Trump was such a disaster, and now without him on the ballot, they saw no reason to vote for Democrats who promised change, but govern like Republicans from the 90s of silence. Was absolute as Crockett accused Abrams of turning voting rights into a brand rather than a movement, of defending democracy in theory without delivering in practice, and of treating criticism as betrayal. Abrams' face flushed with fury, her fists clenched, as she demanded to know how Crockett dared lecture her after all she had built, including the infrastructure that made Crockett's seat possible. Crockett replied that she was not undermining anything but trying to evolve the work for voters born after the Voting Rights Act, a comment Abrams seemed to take as a direct threat to her position, repeating the word evolution with contempt and dismissing Crockett as a backbencher who had never run or built anything beyond social media. Takes the moderator again suggested a break, but Abrams refused, declaring that everyone needed to understand this was about a junior congresswoman trying to make a name by tearing down those who had done the work. Crockett's quiet response cut through the air as she told Abrams that she was the one turning it into a defense of her legacy, not her. Abrams' control finally shattered, her face red and her hands shaking as she pointed directly at Crockett and shouted for her to get out, saying she did not belong in the room or in the conversation, and that she would not sit there and be disrespected. The silence that followed was suffocating, as every phone in the room recorded the implosion of what was meant to be a unity summit. Crockett looked around at the shocked donors, activists, and media, clearly processing that one of the party's most powerful figures had just screamed at her to leave in front of everyone, and that what she did next would decide whether this moment ended her career or define it. Everyone in the room wanted to pretend this was just a minor disagreement that got a little heated, but Jasmine Crockett was not most politicians. She took a deep breath, looked directly at Stacey Abrams, and said the words that would be replayed millions of times over the next 48 hours. No, just that one word, but the way she said it, calm, clear, and completely unintimidated, sent a shockwave through the room. No, she repeated slightly louder. I am not getting out. I was invited to speak at this summit, just like you were. I have just as much right to be here as anyone else. And if you cannot handle someone disagreeing with your strategy without having a meltdown, maybe the problem is not my idea. Maybe the problem is that you have surrounded yourself with so many yes people that you have forgotten how to have an actual debate. The room was so quiet that you could hear the air conditioning humming. Stacey Abrams looked like she had been slapped. She clearly expected Crockett to back down, to apologize, to show the kind of deference that younger Democrats usually show to established leaders like her. Instead, Crockett kept talking. You want to talk about respect, Stacey? Let us talk about respect. I came here to have a conversation about how we can do better by the voters who are losing faith in our party. Instead of engaging with those ideas, you made this personally. You started lecturing me about my credentials instead of addressing my argument. And when I did not back down, you started screaming at me to leave. Several people in the room were now openly staring at Abrams, whose face had gone from red to pale. The confident control persona that had made her a Democratic superstar was gone, replaced by someone who looked increasingly desperate and out of control. Crockett was not done. You know what that tells me? It tells me that deep down you know I am right. You know that our current strategy is not working for young voters. You know that focusing on voting rights without delivering economic change is a losing proposition. But instead of acknowledging that you would rather attack the messenger, Abrams started to interrupt. But Crockett held up her hand. I am not finished, she said with raw authority that surprised everyone in the room, including herself. You said, I do not know what I am talking about because I have only been in Congress for 2 years, but you know what I have learned in those 2 years? I have learned that our party has a serious problem with leaders who think their past accomplishments give them a permanent pass from criticism. The room was transfixed. This was not just a policy disagreement anymore. This was a complete inversion of the expected power dynamic. The established leader was melting down while the junior congresswoman was maintaining her composure and delivering devastating blows. You helped flip Georgia, and that was important. But you know what else happened in Georgia? We barely held on to those Senate seats. In 2020, we lost ground with young voters. We lost ground with working-class voters. And instead of asking why that happened, you are in here defending the same strategies that are clearly not working anymore. Crockett walked closer to where Abrams was standing, and you could see the older woman actually step back slightly. You want to talk about Building things, let me tell you what I have built. I have built relationships with young activists who are ready to give up on electoral politics because they do not think Democrats will ever actually fight for them. I have built connections with working families who are tired of hearing about democracy while their rent keeps going up and their wages stay flat. I have built a presence with voters who want us to stop talking about what Republicans are doing wrong and start talking about what we are going to do right. The moderator tried one more time to intervene. Ladies, perhaps no, Crockett said, not taking her eyes off Abrams. This is important because what just happened here with one of our party's most respected leaders screaming at a colleague for having different ideas. This is exactly why young voters think Democrats are more interested in protecting their own positions than actually fighting for change. She paused, letting that sink. And Stacey, you asked me to get out, but I think the question this room should be asking is, when did the Democratic Party become a place where disagreement gets you shouted down instead of engaged with? When did we become so afraid of new ideas that we treat them as personal attacks? Abrams opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out for the first time in years. Stacey Abrams, a woman who built her reputation on always having the perfect response, was speechless. Crockett looked around the room, making eye contact with donors, activists, and media representatives who were all staring at her in shock. I came here today to talk about how we can expand our coalition and win more elections. I still want to have that conversation, but not with someone who thinks disagreement is betrayal and criticism is disrespect. If you want to have an actual debate about strategy, want him here. If you just want to protect your brand and silence anyone who threatens it, then maybe you are the one who does not belong in this conversation. She sat back down, crossed her legs, and waited. The room was dead silent. All eyes were on Stacey Abrams, who was still standing there looking like she'd been hit by a truck. The woman who had spent years being celebrated as a calm, dignified voice of Democratic resistance had just been completely dismantled by someone half her age with twice her composure. Finally, Abrams managed to speak. I think we should take a break, she said quietly, her voice barely audible, but Crockett shook her head. I do not need a break, Stacey. I need an answer. Are you going to engage with the substance of what I am saying, or are you going to keep making this about personalities and rank and who deserves to be heard? Abrams looked around the room desperately, as if hoping someone would rescue her from the situation she had created, but everyone was just staring, waiting to see what would happen next. She started, then stopped. I think maybe I wish she could not finish the sentence, could not bring herself to admit what everyone in the room had just witnessed. Instead, she sat down heavily in her chair and stared at the table. The most powerful moment came when Crockett leaned forward slightly and said in a voice that was firm but not unkind, Stacey, I did not come here to embarrass you or diminish your accomplishments. I came here because I believe our party can do better, and I believe you're smart enough to help us figure out how. But that conversation cannot happen if you see every new idea as a threat to your legacy instead of an opportunity to build on it. The room stayed silent for what felt like hours, but was probably only about 30 seconds. Finally, James Carville stood up and started clapping slowly. Then a few other people joined in, not enthusiastic applause, but the kind of recognition you give when someone has just done something that took courage. Stacey Abrams never responded. She sat there in silence until moderator officially called for a break, then left the room without speaking to anyone but Jasmine. Crockett's words were already spreading across social media, and America was about to have a very different conversation about the future of the Democratic Party. The footage hit social media before